Chapter 12, Sections 1 to 2 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording, or LibriVox recording during the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Mollegem. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 12. The Principate of Tiberius. Sections 1 to 2. Section 1. Accession of Tiberius. It was generally regarded as a matter of course that Tiberius should step into the place of Augustus. The Roman world did not dream of a revolution, and it was felt that a monarchy naturally fell to him, who stood in the same relation to the now divine Augustus as Augustus himself to the divine Julius. Men universally acquiesced in the succession of Tiberius as the heir, the adopted son, the chosen cohort of the deceased emperor. But though such feelings moved men's minds, constitutionally, the empire was elective, not hereditary, and the Senate and the people could, without infringing the constitution, have conferred the Principate on someone wholly unconnected with the Julian family. Augustus had himself named 3 nobles who might possibly compete with Tiberius: Lepidus, who was equal to the position but despised it; Asinius Gallus, who might desire it but was unequal to it; and Arruntius, who was not unworthy of it and would dare to seek it if a chance were offered. But even from Arruntius, Tiberius had nothing to fear. The only possible rival seemed to be his own kinsman, his nephew Germanicus, who was absent in Gaul, and Agrippa Postumus, who was still pined in the island to which his grandfather had banished him. The unlucky Agrippa was slain by his gaoler immediately after the death of Augustus, and there can be no doubt that the order for his execution was given either by Tiberius or by Livia. When the death of Augustus was announced, Tiberius, by virtue of the tribunician power which he had received in the preceding year for an indefinite period, convoked the Senate. He had already given the watchword to the praetorian cohorts, and sent dispatches to the legions as if he were formally emperor. It is not quite clear whether this was formally an act of usurpation, for it might have been held that the proconsular imperium, which Tiberius possessed before the death of Augustus, having been bestowed by a decree of the Senate and not being merely derived from the imperium of the Princeps, did not cease on the death of the Princeps. In any case, the act seemed an anticipation of his election to the Principate, and Tiberius afterwards made a sort of apology for it to the Senate. But Senate and people, consuls and prefects, took an oath of obedience to him without a sign of hesitation. The proconsular imperium was renewed or confirmed, and the various rights which had been granted to Augustus by separate enactments were conferred upon him doubtless by single comprehensive law, lex de imperio. Tiberius, indeed, adopting the maxims of statecraft which he had learned from his predecessor, feigned reluctance to assume the immense task of directing such a vast empire, and suggested that the functions of government should be divided among more than one ruler. But it was easily seen that the suggestion was not intended seriously. It was part of the transparent comedy which was played henceforward between the Senate and the Princeps. It is important to observe that the practice adopted by Augustus of assuming the empire for a defined period of years was now abandoned. On the other hand, Tiberius would not assume it for life. No term was fixed, but he intimated his intention of resigning the Principate when the state no longer needed him. Here again no one took his words as seriously meant. The first care of Tiberius was the funeral and deification of Augustus. The dead body was borne by senators to the Campus Martius, where it was burned and the ashes were bestowed in the imperial mausoleum. Funeral orations were pronounced both by Tiberius and by his son Drusus. The Senate decreed temples and priests to the Divus Augustus, who was thus raised to place beside his father, the Divus Iulius. His will, which had been deposited in the charge of the Vestal Virgins, was read before the Senate and thus published abroad. It bequeathed 2/3 of his fortune to Tiberius, and the remainder to Livia, who was to be adopted into the Julian family and bear the name Augusta. If these heirs failed, 1/3 of the property was to descend to Drusus, the son of Tiberius, and the remainder to Germanicus and his 3 sons. But these legacies were considerably diminished by the large donations which were left to the citizens and to the praetorian and legionary soldiers. Along with his fortune, the old emperor bequeathed, in his Brevarium Imperii, some councils of government. He deprecated the admission of provincials to the privileged position of Roman citizens. He condemned the further extension of the frontiers of Roman dominion, and he advised that as many men of ability as possible should be engaged in the administration of public affairs. It seems probable that the second of these councils specially regarded the conquest of Transrhenane and Germany, and we shall see how Tiberius acted on it. Section 2. Germanicus on the Rhine. The first weeks of the reign of Tiberius were disturbed by mutinies in the Rhine and Danube armies. Discontent had long been smouldering, and had only been hindered from bursting forth by respect for the old emperor. The soldiers who defended the German frontiers contrasted the hardships which they were obliged to endure in harsh climates and remote regions, the small pay which they received, the unduly long term of service, and the inadequate provision awaiting them at its expiration, with the easy life and the higher pay of the praetorian guards, who could look forward to gifts of land in Italy itself. On the news of the death of Augustus, mutinies broke out simultaneously on the Danube and on the Rhine. The Pannonian army, consisting of 3 legions, under the command of Julius Blasis, threw off the authority of their general, and demanded that the term of service should be reduced from 20 to 16 years, and that the veterans should receive their pensions in money. Blasis was forced to send his son to Rome, to bear these demands to the new emperor, and in the meantime the troops vented their pent-up wrath on the centurions, whom they most detested and refused to perform their military duties. Tiberius dispatched some praetorian cohorts under his son Drusus to treat with the mutineers and restore order, but sent no definite message of concession. The soldiers were enraged when they discovered that Drusus was instructed to evade rather than comply with their demands, and the young prince was with difficulty rescued from their fury. But an eclipse of the moon opportunely took place. The superstitious soldiers were alarmed, and, seized with a fit of remorse, they listened to the indefinite promises of Drusus and returned to their allegiance. The ringleaders were given up and put to death. The revolt of the Rhine legions was a more serious danger. In Pannonia there was no question of setting up a rival emperor, but this danger existed on the Rhine. Germanicus Caesar, governor of Gaul and general of the 8 legions stationed on the German frontier, was marked out as the successor of Tiberius, his adoptive father, and the troops of Lower Germany conceived the design of hastening his reign. They not only demanded shorter service, higher pay, and lighter labour, but proclaimed their intention of carrying Germanicus to Rome and making him emperor. Germanicus was at the time absent in Lugudunum, occupied with the census of Gaul. Aulus Sicina, an experienced officer, was in command of the legions of the Lower Province, while Upper Germany had been assigned to C. Silius. When the news reached Germanicus, he hastened to the camp on the Lower Rhine, which lay in the land of the Ubii, and appeared in the presence of the mutineers. An exciting scene then took place. The soldiers, beseeching their popular commander to right their wrongs, showing him the marks of their wounds and stripes, finally urging him to march to Rome and seize the sovereign power. Germanicus expostulating and praising the virtues of Tiberius. The excitement reached such a pitch that it was necessary to withdraw the general from the presence of the troops. It was a critical moment. The mutineers talked of destroying the town with the Ubii, Oppidum Obiorum, and plundering the cities of Gaul. The German foes beyond the Rhine would not fail to take advantage speedily of the broken discipline of the army. To restore order, Germanicus was forced to concede, in the name of Tiberius, the demands of the troops. He promised that the terms of service should be shortened and that large donatives should be distributed. The legions then returned to their winter quarters, 2 under Germanicus to Oppidum Obiorum, the other 2 under the legatus Aulus Caecina to Castra Vetra. But at this moment messengers arrived from Rome for the purpose of investigating the causes of the discontent, and when the soldiers saw that the concessions might fail to be ratified, the mutiny broke out more furiously than ever. Germanicus decided that his wife and children should leave the camp. It does not appear that he apprehended any serious danger on their account, for no measures were taken to conceal their flight. They departed in broad daylight, and in view of the whole camp. The sight of Agrippina carrying in her arms the little boy Gaius, who had been born and reared in the camp, and whom they had nicknamed Caligula, boots, from the Caligulae or military boots which they made him wear in sport, moved their hearts to remorse. The memory of her father Agrippa, her grandfather Augustus, her father-in-law Drusus, stirred their pride, and when they learned that her destination was the city of the Treveri, jealousy prompted them to make peace with their general. Germanicus seized on the propitious moment to work on their softened feelings, and recalled them to their duty. They fell on their knees before him, begged for forgiveness, and zealously delivered their ringleaders to punishment. It seems likely that this scene was expressly devised by Germanicus as a last resource for appealing to the nobler sentiments of the insurgents. Thus was the danger averted in the Euboean camp. In Castra Vetra, the skilful management of the experienced Caecina restored discipline, while at Mogontiacum the agitators who tried to stir to rebellion the army of the upper province seemed to have totally failed. The only peril which threatened the succession of Tiberius was thus hindered, and for this he had to thank the unshaken fidelity of his nephew. Germanicus had refused to listen when the troops tempted him to disloyalty. He declined to take the flood of the tide which might have led him to fortune. If he had marched to Rome at the head of the Germanic legions, he would have plunged the state once more in civil war. But it is not certain that he would have been the survivor. Germanicus was a man of considerable ability, and his affable manners and urbanity won him friends everywhere. In the camp he associated freely with the soldiers, and they idolized him. He had his father's gift of making himself popular, but he had not his father's genius. It was his dream, however, to restore the work which Drusus had so brilliantly begun, and carry the eagles of Rome once more to the Albis. Immediately after the suppression of the mutiny, the young Caesar decided to employ the discontented legions, who were themselves anxious for active service. Hostilities against the Germans had been slumbering for the past few years, but no treaty had been made since the defeat of Varus, so that in making a sudden incursion the Romans were formally justified. It had been questioned whether Germanicus was not exceeding his powers in taking the offence without the express permission of the emperor. But as he had been entrusted by Augustus with his large command for the purpose of conducting the war and defending the frontier against the Germans, it must clearly have been left to his discretion when he might advance and when he should retire. In the late autumn, 14 A.D., the legions and cohorts of the lower province crossed the Rhine, cut their way through the Silver Sesia, and through the rampart which Tiberius had constructed after the Varian disaster as the limes of Roman territory. Thus they reached the land of the Marsi, who dwelt between the rivers which are now called Lippe and Ruhr. Caecina advanced in front with some light cohorts to reconnoitre and clear the way. It was discovered that the Marsi were to spend the night in solemn festivities, and when the Romans approached their villages after sunset, the inhabitants, unsuspicious and inebriated, offered an easy prey. The legions were divided into 4 wedges cunei, which devastated the country for 50 miles with fire and sword, sparing neither sex nor rage. The holy places of the Marsi, especially the sacred precinct of the deity Tamphana, were levelled with the ground. The fate of the Marsi roused to arms neighbouring tribes, the Bructeri, who lived northward, the Tubantes, who dwelt on the Ruhr, and the Usipetes, between the Lapia and the Manus. They stationed themselves in the woods through which the Romans had to return, but the zeal of the legions and the skill of the commander shook off the enemy, and the winter quarters were safely reached. The revolt on the lower Rhine had caused serious anxiety at Rome, and especially to Tiberius, coming as it did in conjunction with the mutiny in Pannonia. The Pannonic army was nearer Italy. On the other hand, the Germanic army was far larger, and the emperor, uncertain in which of the camps his presence was more needful, and afraid of giving the preference to either, ended by remaining in Rome and watching the issue of events. The news that Germanicus had quelled the mutiny was a great relief, but it was suspected that the military success which he gained in his brief campaign was not so agreeable to Tiberius. If so, the emperor dissembled his jealousy, praised the achievement of his nephew in the presence of the Senate, and granted him the honour of a triumph. The following year was marked by 2 distinct invasions of Germany, which, however, hung closely together and were parts of a common design. Of all the German tribes, the Cherusci, the tribe of Arminius, was the most formidable and the most hostile. They had been the leaders in the fight for freedom, which ended in the Varian disaster. Against them, above all others, policy and revenge excited the spirit of Germanicus. His plan was to prevent the neighbouring peoples from assisting them, and then attack them alone. Their most powerful neighbours were the Chatti, and the first expedition was directed against them. 1. In the spring the 4 legions of the Lower Rhine crossed the river from Castra Vetra, under the command of Caecina, who was to prevent the tribes in that quarter, especially the Marsi and the Cherusci, from marching to aid the Chatti. Caecina's army was augmented by bands of the Cis-Rhenine German tribes, Batavians, Ubii, Sugambri. Meanwhile, Germanicus himself, at the head of the 4 legions of the Upper Rhine, advanced into the territory of Mount Taunus, and attacked the Chatti so suddenly that no serious resistance could be made. Their fortress Matium was destroyed. By this means the Chatti were prevented from making common cause with the Cherusci. That people was distracted at this time by domestic discords. Segestes was invoking the help of the Romans against his enemy and son-in-law Arminius, the hero of the Teutoburg forest. The messengers of Segestes reached Germanicus as he was returning to the Rhine, and besought him to relieve their master, who was blockaded by his enemies. The Roman army retraced their steps, entered the borders of the Cherusci, and delivered their ally, who was able in return to restore some of the spoils of Phares and hand over some important hostages, among these his daughter Thuzelda, the wife of Arminius. That warrior, infuriated at the capture of his wife, left nothing undone to stir up the passions of his nation, and he succeeded in winning over Inguomer, an influential noble who had hitherto sided with the Romans. 2. Germanicus and Caecina, who had signally defeated the Marsi, having returned to the Rhine, prepared for a grand expedition against the enemy, conceived on the same plan which Drusus had formerly adopted with success. The army was divided in 3 parts. Caecina led his legions through the land of the Bructeri to the banks of the upper Armisia. Germanicus and the 4 legions of the upper province embarked to coast along the shore of the North Sea and enter the river at its mouth, while the cavalry under Peter Albinovanus, the poet, marched to the same goal through the land of the Frisi. Successfully united, the combined army laid waste far and wide the land between the Armisia and the Lypia. Here they were near the Saltus Tentobergiensis, where the remains of Varus and his legions lay unburied, and Germanicus could not resist the desire of visiting the spot, erecting a mound over the white bones, and honouring with funeral rites the slaughtered Romans. The lonely and melancholy scene produced a deep impression on the legions, but they were soon required to extricate themselves from a trap similar to that which had ensnared the Varian army. Arminius had hidden his forces in the forest, and the Romans had not secured themselves sufficiently against surprise. But Germanicus and Caecina were more skilful than Varus, and though he did not defeat the enemy, he retreated to Armisia with some difficulty. The return to the Rhine was not easy. The cavalry of Pedo reached their quarters without mischance, but the country through which the way of Caecina lay was heavy and marshy, and the Germans of Arminius and Inguima sought to surround him as they had surrounded Varus. The experienced Caecina was cool and collected in these perils, and knew how to maintain discipline, but he might have failed to extricate his army but for a false move of the foe. The Germans had made a successful attack on the cavalry and baggage of the Romans, and, elated by their luck, proceeded, contrary to the counsels of Arminius, to assault the Roman camp. Waiting until they had reached the rampart, Caecina suddenly threw open the gates and poured out his troops on the besiegers. The Germans suffered a decisive defeat. Inguima was severely wounded, and the Romans were able to proceed on their way. A false rumour of their destruction had gone before them to Castra Vetra, and it was proposed there to break down the Rhine bridge, but the humanity and courage of Agrippina saved the means of retreat for the fugitive army. She stood at the head of the bridge and would not move until the remnant should reach it, and she was repaid by seeing the arrival of the 4 legions safe and whole. The return of Germanicus himself was attended with ill luck and serious losses. He found it necessary to lighten his ships amid the shallow waters of the Phrygian coast, and disembarked 2 legions, directing them to march along the shore. The treacherous equinoctial tides swept away a large number of the soldiers and much of their baggage. On the whole, the campaign could hardly be regarded as a success. The dangers and losses of the return march threw a cloud over the expedition, and Tiberius had some reason to murmur at the little results obtained at such expense. The advantages won by Germanicus were only momentary, for he had done nothing to effect a permanent occupation of the country which he had laid waste. He had built no fort, and established no lines of communication. His wisdom in visiting the battlefield of Varus was open to question. Tiberius, naturally distrustful, nourished some jealousy and perhaps fear of his popular nephew, and there were enemies of Germanicus at Rome who were eager to encourage such feelings. But the emperor had not yet decided to interfere with the plans of Germanicus for the subjugation of Germany, and he professed to regard the achievements of the year as worthy of a triumph. He seems not to have fully made up his mind yet whether the conquest of Germany was really desirable or its permanent occupation possible. The next and last campaign of Germanicus, 16 A.D., was planned on a larger scale. This time he hoped to reach the Albis and break the last resistance of the Cherusci. A fleet of 1,000 ships was collected, with the Rhine broadened and branches into the Verhalis, and the whole army embarked and sailed down the Fossa Drusiana, where Germanicus invoked the spirit and recalled the memory of his father. Before starting, he had taken the precaution to send his legatus, C. Silius, to make a demonstration against the Catti, and had himself, with 6 legions, marched up the valley of Lupia, to secure strongholds and make provisions for the return of his army. The fleet reached the mouth of Amisia safely, and, leaving the ships anchored and guarded, the Romans advanced in a south-eastern direction to the banks of the Visurgis, where the Germans, prepared for their coming, had concentrated their forces under the leadership of the indefatigable Arminius. Here, at length, the Roman invader and the champion of German freedom were to fairly try their strength in a field of battle. The reserved historian Tacitus rises to the occasion as he describes the campaign which decided both the destinies of Germany and the fortunes of his hero Germanicus. He embellishes his Germaniad with tales which have a ring of legend and throw over the young general a halo of romance which his deeds hardly deserved. The colloquy of Arminius and his renegade brother Flavus, standing on the opposite banks of the Visurgis, is, if not true, well imagined. Flavus had lost an eye in the service of the Romans, and Arminius, when he had inquired and learned the cause of the disfigurement, asked, "What was thy reward?" "I received," said Flavus, "increase of pay, a gold chain and crown, and other military distinctions." "Vile badges of slavery," sneered his brother. Flavus continued to praise the greatness of Rome and the emperor, while Arminius appealed to ancestral freedom and the national gods of Germany. At length such bitter words were bandied, and the wrath of the brothers rose so high that they were about to plunge into the stream and grip each other in mortal struggle. But the Romans intervened and dragged Flavus from the bank. The night adventure of Germanicus has the same epic flavour as the converse of the German brethren. The Romans crossed the Visurgis in the face of the enemy, who had retreated into the recesses of a sacred wood, and news was brought that Arminius contemplated a night attack on the Roman camp. Tacitus tells us how Germanicus, like our own Henry V, was seized with the desire to ascertain the spirit of his soldiers, and how for this purpose he disguised himself, and with the skin over his shoulders, attended by one companion, he went round to camp and listened to near the tents. He was pleased to hear his own praises loudly sung, and to observe that the men were eager to punish the perfidious foe. As he traversed the camp, a German horseman rode up to the rampart, and in the Latin tongue invited deserters in the name of Arminius, with promises of lands, wives, and a daily sum of money. Scornful was the answer, "Let the day break, let battle begin, we will ourselves seize your wives and lands." The battle was fought in the plain of Edistaviso, which probably lies to the south of the Porta Westphalica on the right bank of the Visurgis. The Germans had occupied the lower slopes of the mountains, and were protected in the rear by wood, unencumbered with brushwood, and thus offering an easy retreat. The Cherusci placed themselves on the higher hills, intending to rush down upon the Romans in the midst of the battle. While the legions and auxiliaries advanced to attack the German position in the open plain, Germanicus sent a body of cavalry round to outflank the enemy and fall on their rear. This movement was completely successful. The German forces, which were stationed in the wood, were driven out of their cover into the plain, while at the same time the ranks which were drawn up in the plain were beaten back before the onset of the legions into the wood. The confusion was increased by the Cherusci, who were forced by the attack of the cavalry to descend from the hills into the midst of the battle. Arminius essayed bravely to sustain the fight, but he and his fellows were surrounded by the Roman forces, and their doom seemed sealed. Arminius, however, and Inguiomer managed to escape, perhaps owing to the treachery of some German auxiliaries. The rest were slain. This decisive victory was gained by the Romans without any serious loss. The soldiers saluted Tiberius as Imperator, and erected a trophy of the arms of the enemy, subscribing the names of the conquered nations. The defeated and dejected Germans were, it is said, preparing to cross the Albis and leave their country to the victor, but this trophy excited their rage and decided them to make another desperate attempt. It may be suspected, however, that the battle of Idde-Ceriso was less decisive than it has been represented. In any case, the enemy once more collected large forces and occupied a place protected by woods and a deep swamp, and on one side by an old rampart. But Germanicus discovered their position and did not fall into the trap. He attacked them on the side of the earthwork, and forced his way into the small space in which they were thickly packed together. Their position was desperate. If they retreated, they must perish in the march, and with their long swords they could sustain no equal combat with the legions at such close quarters. Germanicus, it is said, was in the thickest of the fray, crying that the Germans must be exterminated, but the barbarians fought it well. Arminius escaped, and the cavalry engagement was indecisive. At nightfall the Romans returned to their camp, victorious indeed, but without having exterminated or routed the foe. The angry Varii were the only tribe who sued for peace. Germanicus erected a second trophy, which told how the army of Tiberius Caesar, having subdued all the nations between the Rhine and the Albis, dedicated this monument to Mars, and Jupiter and Augustus. It was now the middle of summer, and Germanicus, notwithstanding his successes, resolved to retrace his steps. Some of the legions returned by land, others by sea on the ships which awaited them at the mouth of the Amisia. The voyage was disastrous, owing to the violent gales which agitate the North Sea in the autumn season. The fleet was scattered, and Germanicus himself wrecked on the shore of the Corsi. The losses, however, were not so great as was at first thought, and on his return to the Rhine, some successes gained against the Marsi and the Catti partly restored the spirit of the troops, which the sea disaster had damped, and the last of the captured eagles of Varus were recovered. Germanicus deemed that he was now near the goal of his ambition. One more campaign would suffice, he thought, for the complete subjugation of Germany. But destiny decreed, and Tiberius judged, otherwise. It is clear enough that the victories of the last campaign were far less important and complete than Tacitus has tried to make them out. Their results were only temporary, and the emperor, perhaps wisely, decided that no abiding result was likely to be achieved by Germanicus. There was indeed reason for disappointment. Nothing had been accomplished in proportion to the magnitude of the expeditions. Accordingly Tiberius offered the consulship to his nephew, and this was equivalent to a recall. How far the sovereign was influenced by a lurking jealousy of the popular general, how far he deemed it inexpedient that a close connection between Germanicus and the Rhine army should continue, we cannot say, but it is only fair to point out that the recall of Germanicus can be completely explained by political considerations without taking into account any personal motives. Tiberius may have come to the conclusion that annual invasions of Germany were too slow and costly a method of winning the new province, even though it was certain that this method must ultimately succeed. A different policy was suggested by the intestine feuds of the barbarians. If the Romans retired from the field, a deadly contest must soon take place between the Saxon and the Suevian tribes, and when the enemy had enfeebled themselves in domestic war, the Romans might step in and take possession of their country. This was a plausible policy, and was perhaps seriously entertained by Tiberius. But it is possible that he had really come to regard the advance to the Albis as a visionary idea which it would not be expedient to realize. If the Rhine troops changed their station to the banks of the Albis, would not another army be required to watch Gaul, and would the state be able to support another army? These were the questions which a statesman had to consider, and they may have decided Tiberius, as they seem to have decided Augustus, that the Rhine was roughly the limit. In any case, financial considerations had probably much to do with the disappointment of the dreams of Germanicus. From the year 17 A.D. forward, we never find one man uniting under his single authority both the government of the Gallic provinces and the command of the Germanic armies. Henceforward, the 3 provinces of Gaul are administered by 3 praetorian governors, and the 2 frontier districts, Upper and Lower Germany, are kept strictly separate under 2 consular legati, who are always, up to the time of Hadrian, strictly military commanders, legati exercitus inferiores et superiores, not legati provinciae, though often loosely spoken of as such. The financial administration of these military districts was at first combined with that of Belgica, like that of Numidia with Africa. It is to be observed that for many years yet the province of Lower Germany extended beyond the Rhine and as far as the Lower Amisia. The young general celebrated a brilliant triumph, 26th of May, 17 A.D., over the conquered nations between the Rhine and Elbe. Thusnelda, the wife of Arminius, with her infant son Thymelichus, whom she had borne in captivity, was among the captives who adorned the procession. It is said that in the midst of the festivities people felt a gloomy presentiment, comparing the young Caesar with his father Drusus and his uncle Marcellus, who like him had been so popular but had died so early. Brave and unlucky, they said, have been the loves of the Roman people. After his triumph, Germanicus was appointed to an honourable mission in the East. At the same time his cousin Drusus was sent to Illyricum to observe the course of affairs in northern Europe. Arminius and his Cherusci, with their Saxon federates, having no longer to oppose the invasions of the Romans, hastened to deal with the Suevian state in the south, over which Maroboduus held sway with the title of king. It will be remembered that this chief had refused to join Arminius after the defeat of Varus. He was an admirer of Roman civilization, having spent part of his youth in Rome, and he tried to introduce Roman manners and government among his countrymen. Throughout this struggle for freedom he had remained persistently neutral. The centre of his power and his palace lay in Boiohaemon, but he was recognized as the head of a large and loose Suevic confederacy. Of these tribes, the Semnones and Langobardi deserted his cause on the first attack of the Cherusci. On the other hand, the Cheruscan Inguiomer went over to Maroboduus. A decisive battle was fought, in which the Suevians were defeated, and many more of his allies deserted the Suevic king, who then applied for aid to the Roman emperor. Tiberius immediately sent Drusus to confirm peace, perhaps really to effect the downfall of Maroboduus. The unlucky king was finally overthrown and driven from his realm by Catuelda, chief of the Catones, a people who lived on the lower Vistula. They invaded the land of the Marcomanni, and stormed the town and stronghold of Maroboduus, who was forced to flee to the refuge of the empire and throw himself on the emperor's mercy. Ravenna was assigned to him as a dwelling-place, where Thusnelda and her son had been also doomed to live. It was a curious historical coincidence that the city of the marshes, which was destined 5 centuries later to be the capital of the great German hero, the Ostrogothic King Theodoric, should have been selected as the habitation of Maroboduus, his predecessor, in attempting to spread Roman ideas among his countrymen. Maroboduus lived 18 years at Ravenna, vainly expecting to be restored to power. He had the satisfaction to see Catuelda overthrown, and like himself seeking a refuge from the Romans. He had the satisfaction to see his younger rival Arminius succumb to the guile of a domestic enemy, 21 A.D. After the defeat of the Suevians, The hero of Germany had been false himself to the freedom for which he had fought, and tried to establish a monarchical power. He was undoubtedly, says the Roman historian, the deliverer of Germany, and not one of those who attacked the Roman people in the beginning of its power, but when it was at the height of its prosperity. He lost battles, but in war he was unconquered. He died at the age of 37 in the 12th year of his power, and he is still sung among the barbarians, although to the annals of the Greeks he is unknown, and among the Romans not as celebrated as he deserves. End of Chapter 12, Section 1 to 2.